Thinking conducive to spiritual training. Thinking is linked to and follows cognition. The process of cognition begins at the point where a sense-base ayatana encounters a sense object, ramana. At this point, consciousness arises, vijnana, the awareness of a sense object, for example, seeing a form, hearing a sound, or knowing a mental object. When this process is complete, it is called cognition, or literally according to the Pali as contact, phassa. With cognition there arises some form of sensation, vedana, say of pleasure and ease, suffering and discomfort, or a neutral feeling. At the same time there arises perception, sanya, the naming, designation or recognition of the sense object. From here there follows thinking, vitaka, thoughts, reflections, and deliberations. This process of cognition is the same, regardless of whether one encounters and experiences something externally, or whether one thinks of something and contemplates it in the mind. Using the act of seeing as an example, this process can be illustrated as follows. Ayatana plus physical form, ramana, plus seeing, chakra vijnana, equals contact, phassa, to sensation, vedana, to perception, sanya, to thinking, vitaka. The act of thinking plays a very important role in determining a person's personality and way of life, as well as shaping society as a whole. Thinking, therefore, is an essential factor in spiritual training. Thinking, however, is itself determined by various factors and conditions. One factor which exerts a powerful influence on thinking is sensation, vedana, in particular the feelings of pleasure and pain. Ordinarily, when people contact sense impressions and experience feelings, unless other factors enter to correct or intercept the process, these feelings determine the way a person thinks. If the feelings are pleasurable or comforting, one delights in them. One wishes to acquire or consume the object. This is craving, tanha, in an affirmative sense. If the feelings are painful or oppressive, one is averse to them. One wishes to escape from or eliminate the object. This is craving in an adversative sense. At this point, the person creates elaborate thoughts and ideas about the sense object, acting as the source of that feeling. The object becomes the focus of a person's thinking, accompanied by sanya, memories and perceptions of this object. These proliferations of thought follow the course of the person's likes and aversions. The determining factors for thought are a person's accumulated proclivities, prejudices, habits, disposition, and mental defilements, collectively referred to as mental formations, sankhara. He or she thinks within the confines and limitations, and along the line of these mental formations. Expressions of speech and physical actions may then follow in the wake of these thoughts. If these thoughts are not expressed as outward actions, they still have an impact on a person's mind. They limit and constrict the mind and create various forms of mental distress, agitation, disturbance, depression, and confusion. Thoughts related to specific subjects can create mental bias and distortion, resulting in a failure to see things according to the truth, while some thoughts may be tainted by greed or hostility. In the case that one experiences neutral sensations, neither pleasurable nor painful, If one is not skilled at reflection and allows oneself to remain under their influence, one's thinking will be aimless and incoherent or completely stifled. This is an unfavorable and unwholesome situation, leading to problems and greater suffering. The main factors of this process can be illustrated thus: contact to sensation to craving, both affirmative and adversative to suffering, passa, vedana, tanha, dukkha. For most people, this process of compounding problems occurs almost continually. In a single day, it may occur repeatedly and countlessly. The life of a person lacking spiritual training tends to be dominated and determined by this way of thinking. It requires no intelligence, understanding, or special capability. It is the most basic way in which a human being operates, and the more a person has accumulated the habit of thinking in this way, the easier this process unfolds automatically, as if stuck in a pre-established rut. Because this process functions without any guidance by mindfulness and wisdom, it generates ignorance, avidya. Rather than being conducive to solving problems, it creates more problems and increases suffering. It is antithetical to spiritual training. Technically, it is thus referred to as the mode of conditionality leading to suffering. The basic attribute of this way of thinking is that it serves to gratify craving. In sum, it can be referred to as the process of thinking that panders to craving, thinking that causes problem, or simply as the cycle of suffering. The beginning of spiritual training begins with the application of mindfulness and wisdom. Here, a person no longer allows this aforementioned process of thinking or mode of conditionality to function unabated and unchecked. One uses mindfulness, wisdom, and other spiritual factors to interrupt, or reduce the flow of this way of thinking, resulting in a severance of the cycle, or a transformation and altered course of thinking. One begins to be liberated, to no longer be enslaved by this process of thinking. At first, an altered course of thinking may result from views or traditional ways of thinking transmitted by external sources, say by other people or social institutions, to which one adheres out of faith. Generally speaking, the most such external instruction can do is to deter or restrain one from blindly following a course of thinking, pandering to craving, or perhaps it can provide one with an alternative fixed pattern of thinking. But it does not necessarily lead to a progressive, independent way of thinking. If the instruction is exceptional, however, it can generate the kind of faith that leads people to think for themselves. An example of instruction that leads to a strictly prescribed, unyielding form of faith, and is not a vehicle for further contemplation, is to have others believe that everything in the world is governed and controlled by some divine being, or occurs randomly or by accident. If one believes in such teachings, all one has to do is wait for the will of God, or leave everything up to fate. One need not investigate or reflect on things. Conversely, an example of instruction that generates a kind of faith leading to contemplation is to have others believe that all things exist according to causes and conditions. If one believes this, then no matter what happens, one will investigate and probe into the underlying causes and conditions, and one will develop an increased knowledge and understanding. Wholesome thinking and contemplation induced by a faith in external instruction begins with wise reflection, uniso manasikara. In other words, skillful instruction generates a faith leading to wise reflection. With the arising of wise reflection, spiritual training has begun. From this point, a person applies and develops wisdom, which helps to solve problems and is the path to the cessation of suffering. In a nutshell, thinking that supports and promotes wisdom is spiritual training. Wise reflection plays an especially important role by preventing feeling, Vedana, from producing craving, Tanha. When one applies wise reflection, one experiences feeling, but without it leading to craving. And when there is no craving, one does not create fanciful ideas, mental proliferation, subject to the power of craving. When one severs thinking processes, pandering to craving, skillful systematic reflection leads to the path of wisdom development and to the end of suffering. The two kinds of thinking can be illustrated thus: contact, pasa, to sensation, vedana, to craving, tanha, and wise reflection, uniso manasik. Contact to sensation, to craving, tanha, to suffering, dukkha, or contact sensation to wise reflection, uniso manasikara, to wisdom, panya, to the end of suffering. In any case, for ordinary people, even if they have begun a spiritual training, these two ways of thinking arise alternatively, and one way of thinking may interfere with the other. For example, the first process may unfold until it reaches craving, but then wise reflection steps in to cut off the process and steer it in a new direction, or the latter process may reach the stage of wisdom. Yet craving in a new guise hijacks the process. It can thus occur that the fruits of wisdom are corrupted to serve the interests of craving. When those persons who have completed spiritual training think, they apply analytical reflection, uniso manasigara. When they are not thinking, they abide mindfully in the present moment. That is, they are attentive to those activities in which they are engaged. To say that one applies analytical reflection when one thinks also implies that one applies mindfulness, sati, because wise reflection is a source of nourishment for mindfulness. When thinking proceeds in a systematic, purposeful way, attention does not stray or drift aimlessly. Mindfulness then functions to keep attention on the task at hand. Analytical reflection is thus a key factor in spiritual training, connected to the essential stage of wisdom development. It is required for living a virtuous life, helping to solve problems and acting as a refuge for people. In the gradual process of wisdom development, wise reflection is part of a stage beyond faith, because at this stage a person begins to think independently from others. Within the system of spiritual training, wise reflection is an internal factor connected to the development and application of thought. It can be defined as a proper method of thinking, methodical thinking, or analytical thinking, and it has the following attributes. It prevents one from looking at things superficially. It leads to self-reliance and leads to liberation, freedom from suffering, true peace, and pure wisdom, which are the highest goals of Buddhism. The preceding material has presented a general introduction to the two initial factors of spiritual training. The utterances of others, Parato Gosa, which can also be described as having a virtuous friend, Kalyana Mitta, which is an external factor and a matter dealing with faith, and wise reflection, Yoniso Manasikara, which is an internal factor and a matter dealing with a wisdom. From here on in this chapter, the focus will be solely on wise reflection to elucidate the methods of thinking distinctive to Buddha Dhamma. Importance of wise reflection. Monks, just as the dawn is the forerunner and precursor of the rising of the sun, so too the fulfillment of wise reflection, Yoniso Manasikara, is the forerunner and precursor for the arising of the Noble Eightfold Path for a monk. It is to be expected of a monk who has brought wise reflection to completion that he will develop and cultivate the Noble Eightfold Path. Monks, just as the dawn's silver and golden light is the precursor to the rising of the sun, so too for a monk wise reflection is the forerunner and precursor for the arising of the 7 factors of enlightenment. When a monk is accomplished in wise reflection, it is to be expected that he will develop and cultivate the 7 factors of enlightenment. Monks, just as this body is sustained by nutriment, subsists in dependence on nutriment, and cannot subsist without nutriment, so too the 5 hindrances are sustained by nutriment, subsist in dependence on nutriment, and cannot subsist without nutriment. And what is their nutriment? A frequent lack of wise reflection. Monks, just as this body is sustained by nutriment, subsists in dependence on nutriment, and cannot subsist without nutriment, so too the 7 factors of enlightenment are sustained by nutriment, subsist in dependence on nutriment, and cannot subsist without nutriment. And what is their nutriment? A repeated application of wise reflection. Monks, by careful attention, Yoniso Manasikara, by careful right striving, Yoniso Sampadana, I arrived at unsurpassed liberation. I realized unsurpassed liberation. You too, by careful attention, by careful right striving, shall arrive at unsurpassed liberation, shall realize unsurpassed liberation. Monks, I say that the destruction of the tents is for one who knows and sees, not for one who does not know and see. Who knows and sees what? Wise attention and unwise attention. When one attends one unwisely, unarisen tents arise and unarisen tents increase. When one attends wisely, unarisen tents do not arise, and arisen tents are abandoned. Monks, whatever states there are that are wholesome, partaking of the wholesome, pertaining to the wholesome, they are all rooted in wise reflection, converge upon wise reflection, and wise reflection is declared to be the chief among them. Same here, Mahali, greed, hatred, delusion, unwise reflection, wrongly directed attention is the cause, the condition, for evil actions, for the existence of evil. Non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, wise reflection, rightly directed attention is the cause, the condition for virtuous actions, for the existence of virtuous actions. No other thing do I know which is so responsible for causing unarisen wholesome states to arise and arisen unwholesome states to wane as wise reflection. In one who reflects wisely, wholesome states not yet arisen will arise, and unwholesome states that have arisen will wane. No other thing do I know which is so conducive to great benefit, which is so conducive for the stability, non-decline, and non-disappearance of the true Dhamma as wise reflection. In regard to internal factors, no other thing do I know which is so conducive to great benefit as wise reflection. For a monk who is still in training, who has not yet realized the fruit of arahantship, and who aspires to the unsurpassed security from bondage, I do not see any other internal factor that is so helpful as wise reflection. A monk who applies wise reflection is able to eliminate the unwholesome and to cultivate the wholesome. I do not say any other thing so conducive for generating an arisen right view, for increasing arisen right view as wise reflection. And one who reflects wisely on arisen right view will arise, and arisen right view will increase. I do not see any other thing so conducive for generating unarisen enlightenment factors, or for bringing unarisen enlightenment factors to completion as wise reflection. And one who reflects wisely on arisen enlightenment factors will arise, and arisen enlightenment factors will be brought to completion. No other thing do I know on account of which an arisen doubt does not arise, and arisen doubt is abandoned as much as on account of wise attention. For one who attends properly to signs of impurity, an arisen lust will not arise, and arisen lust will be abandoned. For one who attends properly to the liberation of mind by loving kindness, an arisen hatred will not arise, and arisen hatred will be abandoned. For one who attends properly to all things, an arisen delusion will not arise, and arisen delusion will be abandoned. When one attends wisely, an arisen sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, doubt does not arise, and arisen sensual desire, doubt is abandoned. At the same time, the unarisen enlightenment factor of mindfulness, the unarisen enlightenment factor of equanimity arises, and the arisen enlightenment factor of mindfulness, equanimity, comes to fulfillment. There are 9 things that are greatly supportive and which are rooted in wise reflection. When one possesses wise reflection, joy arises. When one is joyful, delight arises. When one experiences delight, the body is relaxed and tranquil. When the body is relaxed, one experiences happiness. For one who is happy, the mind is concentrated. When the mind is concentrated, one knows and sees according to the truth. When one knows and sees according to the truth, one becomes disenchanted. With disenchantment, one becomes dispassionate. By dispassion, one is liberated. Definition of wise reflection. The compound term Yoniso Manasikara is comprised of the 2 words Yoniso and Manasikara. Yoniso is derived from the word Yoni, origin, place of birth, womb, and is variously translated as cause, root, source, wisdom, method, means, or path. Manasikara is translated as mental activity, thinking, consideration, reflection, directing attention, or contemplation. As a compound, the term Yoniso Manasikara is traditionally defined as a skillfully directing attention. The commentaries and sub-commentaries elaborate on this definition and explain the nuances of this term by presenting various synonyms as follows. 1. Upaya Manasikara, methodical reflection. To think or reflect by using proper means or methods. Systematic thinking. This refers to methodical thinking that enables one to realize and exist in harmony with the truth, and to penetrate the nature and characteristics of all phenomena. To pata mana sikara, suitable reflection. To think following a distinct course or in a proper way. To think sequentially and in order. To think systematically. This refers to thinking in a well-organized way, example, in line with cause and effect. To not think in a confused, disorderly way. To not at one moment be preoccupied by one thing and then in the next moment jump to something else, unable to sustain a precise, well-defined sequence of thought. This factor also includes the ability to guide thinking in a correct direction. 3. Karana manasikara, reasoned thinking, analytical thinking, investigative thinking, rational thinking. This refers to inquiry into the relationship and sequence of causes and conditions, to contemplate and search for the original causes of things, in order to arrive at their root or source, which has resulted in a gradual chain of events. For Upadaka Manasikara, effective thinking, to apply thinking in a purposeful way in order to yield desired results. This refers to thinking and reflection that generates wholesome qualities. Example, thoughts that arouse effort, an ability to think in a way that dispels fear and anger, and contemplations which support mindfulness or which strengthen and stabilize the mind. These four definitions describe various attributes of the kind of thought referred to as wise reflection, yoniso manasikara. At any one time, wise reflection may contain all or some of these attributes. These four definitions may be summarized in brief as methodical thinking, systematic thinking, analytical thinking, or thinking inducing wholesomeness. It is challenging, however, to come up with a single definition or translation for yoniso manasikara. Most translations will only capture limited nuances of this term and are not comprehensive. The alternative is to give a lengthy definition, as presented above. The difficulty of translating this term notwithstanding, there are prominent attributes of this way of thinking which can be used to represent all the other attributes and which can be translated in brief. For example, methodical thinking, skillful thinking, analytical thinking, and investigative thinking. Once one has gained a thorough understanding of this Pali term, it is convenient to rely on a concise translation like wise reflection, systematic reflection, or careful attention. Earlier, I mentioned the relationship between the internal factor of wise reflection and the external factor of instruction by others or virtuous friends. Here, let us focus more closely on how a virtuous friend, by relying on the principle of faith, can help those people who are unable to think for themselves and apply wise reflection. In respect to the first three attributes of wise reflection described above, virtuous friends are only able to point out or throw light on specific truths, but practitioners must contemplate and gain understanding by themselves. When it comes to the stage of true understanding, faith is inadequate. In regard to these three attributes, faith is thus extremely limited. In respect to the fourth attribute, reflection generating wholesome qualities, however, faith plays a powerful role. For example, some people are weak and easily daunted, or think in irrational and harmful ways. If a virtuous friend is able to establish faith in such people, this will be very helpful for them. He or she may inspire and encourage them by using skillful means. Having said this, there are some people who are naturally endowed with wise reflection and are able to think for themselves. In discouraging or distressing situations, they are able to effectively motivate themselves and think of ways to address the problem. On the contrary, if one has evil friends or applies unwise attention, despite finding oneself in good circumstances and encountering good things, one is likely to think or act in bad ways. For instance, when discovering a pleasant, secluded place, a bad person may think of it as a suitable place to commit a crime. In a similar vein, some people are highly suspicious. When they see someone else smile, they think that they are being ridiculed or insulted. If one allows this course of thinking to proceed unimpeded, unwise attention will nourish and strengthen such unwholesome states of mind. For example, a person who habitually sees things in a negative light will begin to see others as adversaries. Similarly, a person who is habitually afraid and sees others as thinking ill of him may develop a mental disorder of paranoia. Depending on either wise reflection or unwise reflection, the same subject matter may result in very different behavior for different people. For example, one person may think of death with improper attention and consequently experience fear, depression, apathy, or confusion. Another person may think of death with wise reflection and thus appreciate the need to abstain from unwholesome actions. He or she will be calm, heedful, and ardent, hastening to perform good deeds. In terms of insight into reality, wise reflection is not wisdom itself, but rather a condition for the arising of wisdom. That is, wise reflection generates right view. The Milinda Panha describes the difference between reflection and wisdom thus. First, animals such as goats, sheep, cows, buffalo, camels, and donkeys possess a form of reflection, manasikara, mental application, but they do not possess wisdom, nor is their reflection analytical, yoniso. Second, manasikara has the characteristic of contemplation and reflection, whereas wisdom panya has the characteristic of severing. Manasikara gathers together and submits ideas to wisdom, which is then able to eliminate mental defilement, similar to a man grasping an ear of rice by his left hand, enabling him to successfully harvest it with a sickle held in his right hand. Based on this interpretation, Yoneso Manasikara is a kind of mental engagement, Manasikara, leading to an application and development of wisdom. The Papancha Sudani states that unwise attention at Yoneso Manasikara is the root source of the round of rebirth, Vata, causing beings to accumulate problems and to swim around in suffering. This text also explains that, when it is allowed to prosper, unwise attention increases both ignorance, avidya, and the craving for becoming, bhavatanha. With the arising of ignorance, the cycle of dependent origination begins, starting with ignorance acting as the condition for volitional formations, sankhara, and completed with the arising of the whole mass of suffering. The beginning of the cycle of dependent origination can also be designated by the arising of craving, tanha, starting with craving acting as a condition for grasping, and similarly completed with the mass of suffering. Conversely, wise reflection is the root cause for the cycle of turning away, vivata, enabling one to escape from the whirlpool of suffering and to truly solve problems. With the arising of wise reflection, a person begins to practice according to the Eightfold Path, with the right view as the leading factor. Right view here is equivalent to true knowledge, vijja. With the arising of true knowledge, ignorance ceases. With the end of ignorance, the cessation cycle, nirodha vara, of dependent origination is set in operation, leading gradually to the cessation of suffering. These processes can be illustrated thus. Round of rebirth, vata, unwise reflection, ayoniso manasikara, ignorance, avidya, to volitional formations, sankara, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, equals the arising of suffering. Craving, tanha, to grasping, upadana, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, equals the arising of suffering. Cycle of turning away, vibhata. Wise reflection, yoniso manasikara, to cultivation of the path, magga bhavana. Right view, samadhiti, equals true knowledge, vijja, to cessation of ignorance, to cessation of volitional formations, and the cessation of suffering. The term yoniso manasikara has a wide range of meaning, including thinking concerned with moral issues and thinking in line with virtuous and truthful principles, which one has studied and understood. Basic levels of contemplation which do not require a profound degree of wisdom include thoughts of emancipability, thoughts of loving kindness, thoughts of generosity and assistance, and thoughts of generating inner strength, determination, and courage. Some contemplations, however, require refined and subtle degrees of wisdom. For example, an analysis of subsidiary factors or an investigation into causes and conditions. Because the meaning of wise reflection is so comprehensive, everyone is capable of applying it, especially elementary levels of contemplation. All people need to do is direct their course of thinking in a wholesome direction, corresponding to teachings they have received and ideas they have nurtured. This basic form of wise reflection helps to generate mundane right view and is greatly influenced by faith, which comes about through the words of others, para to goso, including one's education, culture, and the presence of virtuous friends. Faith acts as an anchor for the mind and an internal force. When a person cognizes a sense object or encounters a particular situation, the course of his or her thinking is directed by the force of faith, as if faith has already dug a channel for thinking to go. For this reason, the Buddha stated that correct faith is the nourishment for wise reflection. External instruction from virtuous friends, which uses faith as a channel, is able to gradually increase understanding and introduce a person to new ideas. For example, by way of consultation and by asking questions to clear up doubts. When it is applied repeatedly and nourished by faith, proper reflection develops and becomes more agile, deepening wisdom. When one contemplates and sees that the teachings one has received are truly correct and beneficial, one becomes more confident and faith increases. In this way, wise reflection enhances faith. It urges people to make a greater effort in their studies, until eventually their own reflections lead them to realization and deliverance. Here, a person's spiritual practice relies on an integration between internal and external factors. Wholesome influence from external sources is implied in the phrase. Be your own refuge, with no one else as your refuge. The Buddha did not reject external influences. Indeed, external influences and the quality of faith are extremely important, but the key determining factor lies within, that is, wise reflection. The more one is able to apply wise reflection, the less one relies on external factors. Similarly, if someone does not apply wise reflection at all, any amount of help from virtuous friends is in vain. As most students of Buddhism know, mindfulness sati is a vital factor that is required for every activity. The problem arises, however, of how to establish mindfulness in time and, once it is established, how to sustain it in a consistent, continuous way, so that it is not broken and does not slip away. In this context, there are teachings which explain how wise reflection nourishes mindfulness, assisting in the establishment and the uninterrupted flow of mindfulness. If one possesses systematic, coherent, and effective reflection, one is able to sustain mindfulness consistently. If one is unable to reflect properly, however, or if one's thinking is ineffectual or aimless, mindfulness will keep slipping away, and one will be unable to sustain it. It is neither correct nor possible to truly compel or constrain mindfulness. The correct course is to nourish mindfulness and to generate its supportive conditions. If these conditions are present, mindfulness arises. This is part of a natural process. One thus needs to act in accord with this process. The function of wise reflection is to cut off ignorance and craving, or in an affirmative sense, it summons wisdom and wholesome qualities. Generally speaking, when a person encounters a sense object, the process of thinking begins immediately. At this point, two distinct forces vie with one another. If ignorance and craving are able to seize control of thinking, the thought process will be subject to these factors and shaped by mental formations, based on likes and dislikes, and on pre-established concepts and ideas. If wise reflection is able to bar and cut off ignorance and craving, it will lead thinking in a correct direction, resulting in a thought process free from these negative factors. The corrupted thought process is replaced by the process of knowing and seeing, jnana dasana, or of true knowledge and liberation, vijja vimukti. Generally speaking, when ordinary unawakened beings encounter a sense object, their thinking follows the course of ignorance and craving. They overlay the experience with their likes and dislikes, or with their pre-established ideas. This is the point at which thoughts connected to that experience or sense object begin to be shaped and molded by ignorance and craving, a process which occurs because of a person's accumulated habitual tendencies. To be influenced by ignorance and craving in one's thinking is to see things as one wants them to be or not to be. One's thinking is bound by personal attachments and aversions. This results in an incorrect discernment of things, in prejudices based on preferences and aversions, in misunderstanding, and in distorted conceptions. Moreover, it is a cause for confusion, listlessness, loneliness, despondency, fear, gratification, and subsequent disappointment, stress, and frustration, all of which are various forms of mental affliction. Reflecting wisely entails seeing things according to the truth or according to causal relationships, not according to ignorance and craving. In other words, one sees things according to their own nature, not according to one's wishes and desires. When unawakened persons experience something, their thoughts immediately align themselves with likes and dislikes. The function of wise reflection is to cut off this process and to seize the active role. It then directs the course of thinking in a pure systematic direction. By contemplating according to causes and conditions, the result is that one understands the truth and generates wholesome states, or at the very least one responds to things in the most appropriate way. Wise reflection allows people to make good use of thinking, to be a master of their own thoughts, to call upon thinking in order to solve problems and to live at ease. This is the opposite to unwise reflection, which allows thoughts to manipulate and enslave the mind, to drag people into difficulty, oppress them in various ways, and take away their independence. Note also that in the course of wise reflection, mindfulness and clear comprehension are constant factors inherent in the process because wise reflection constantly nourishes these factors. In sum, wise reflection cuts off ignorance and craving. These two, these two negative qualities always appear in tandem, although in some cases ignorance is prominent and craving unpronounced, while at other times craving is dominant and ignorance concealed. Given this fact, it is possible to present two definitions for wise reflection, according to the domain role of either ignorance or craving. Wise reflection is a form of thinking that cuts off ignorance, or a form of thinking that cuts off craving. The distinction is as follows. 1. When ignorance is dominant, thinking gets stuck on and revolves around a single theme in a confused and disconnected way. One does not know which direction to go, or else one's thoughts are incoherent, disordered, and irrational, for example in the case of someone who is caught in fear. 2. When craving is dominant, thinking inclines in the direction of likes and dislikes, preferences and aversions, or attachment and revulsion. One is preoccupied with those things one likes or dislikes, and one's thinking is shaped in accord with pleasure and displeasure. This distinction notwithstanding, on a profound level, ignorance is the source of craving, and craving reinforces ignorance. Therefore, if one is to eliminate all affliction and unwholesomeness completely, one must go to the source and eliminate ignorance.